Well, in our last few seconds here, what do you think is going to happen in Pennsylvania? Are we going to have a good couple of years?
I think Pennsylvania. I think there is a unity even with the differences within the caucus on some things, and I think there's some important things we can do even with fiscal problems where cutting taxes will be opposed by some people because how are you going to pay for it? A legitimate argument. I think I'm a supply sider. I think ultimately you'll get the growth, but in the short run that's a problem. But I think we can do some things like fix the regulatory climate, fix the legal climate, look at our operations and our processes to streamline them, make them more efficient, make government run better. Before we start even talking about doing less for people, let's do what we do well and efficiently, and that will give us some savings that we can roll over into other endeavors. And I do think there is unity from Sam Smith and Mike Turzai and Dominic Pileggi on many of those topics that they can work with Governor Corbett with.
Spoken like a true neoconservative, actually. Don't make government larger or smaller, make it work. Have what we have and make it work. Your organization, along with the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association and the Chamber of Commerce, are certainly going to be right in the center of this attempt to rejuvenate Pennsylvania's economy. And
we've been talking to all those players for many months now, and we have some things we think we're ready to go and help them out. Every Pennsylvanian, regardless of their views, has to be a partner in this, and that's what we want to do.
Okay, we will talk to you again soon, Dave. Thank you for being with us today. We'll be back with the second segment of Behind the Headlines right after this.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The Council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions that make the Commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And the American Home Bank, a nationally chartered and FDIC-insured yet locally owned and operated bank in central Pennsylvania. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Express, transporting construction, farm, and industrial equipment throughout the United States. And by Penn Waste, your best local choice for your waste removal and recycling needs.
Welcome back to the second segment of Behind the Headlines. And on this segment, Maura and I, in our special election edition, have one of the state's leading pollsters here to talk about the various races. And we want to welcome Jimmy Lee. Jim, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here, Charlie.
Jim, of course, you are the president and the chairman of Susquehanna Polling and Research, located in mid-state Pennsylvania. So we're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you.
And you've really been making a name for yourself, not only statewide but nationally, because of your accurate polling results. We like to, we sort of covered with Dave Patti the business reaction to this election. Let's go through the various races, if you will. Let's talk about the U.S. Senate race first. A nail-biter to the end. Pat Toomey, of course, the Republican, and he was criticized by Joe Sestak, the former admiral who worked in the Clinton administration, as being a friend of Wall Street business, and he tried to tar him with that. Did that almost work?
Well, it almost did work, and I appreciate the kind introduction you gave us. That race had all the makings of being tight all along. The polling consistently showed that we had done that race would be very close. Of course, it was a 2-point margin for Pat Toomey. And Pat Toomey won that for two fundamental reasons. Number one, he had a sharper message than Joe Sestak. The Toomey message all along was rein in federal spending, make the election a referendum on the president, whose job approval rating nationwide was down, and whose job approval rating in the state was down about 10 points in comparison to what it was after he was elected president. So Pat Toomey was in a unique position to have the perfect message at the right time. And of course, Pat Toomey was talking about fiscal discipline when it wasn't cool to talk about it 6 years ago when he ran against Specter and tried to make the same argument and lost narrowly. So Pat Toomey was the right messenger at the right time, because the country has shifted since the president's been elected. The polling shows Americans were growing more uncomfortable with the policies of the Obama administration on spending. And So Pat Toomey was in a great position to take advantage of that. So he had the sharper message. And the other reason I think he won was because the Republican voters were clearly more energized this year. All the polling has supported that. The Republicans were energized, Democrats were more disaffected. And that's why you saw Obama come to the state twice this month. That's why you saw Michelle Obama come to Philadelphia to try to gin up the Democratic turnout in the city. Joe Sestak needed big margins out of southeastern Pennsylvania. And because Pennsylvania is so Democrat, we have 1.2 million more Democrats in the state than Republicans, Joe Sestak was always in the game. And the polling has shown consistently that after the primary election when Sestak won, Democrat voters, by and large, were very supportive of Sestak. They liked this guy. He defeated Specter in all but 3 counties in the state. And this is still a very Democratic state. So our polling since the primary has shown a dead heat. We never had this race a blowout for anybody. And we've seen polling that had Toomey up by 7, up by 10. We weren't buying it.
Okay.
These two had a very equal image, and we knew this would go down to the wire. The enthusiasm gap, I think, gave Toomey the edge last night. I think that's what you saw.
Well, we talked a little bit with Dave Patti that midterm shifts are not uncommon. But from everything I've read, this is the worst midterm performance by a president's party in history. So using the words, as we've said before, historic, it really is historic. Do you think it is more a pro-Republican or an anti-Obama?
That's an excellent question. I do believe it was historic because you had a confluence of factors working that we probably haven't seen in 4 decades. A very weak economy with unemployment still hovering above 9%. A phenomenal movement in the country by the Tea Party constituency that has now mobilized in 50 states and created this current of turnout that clearly aided Republicans in many key states. Thirdly, you had a president whose policies were becoming increasingly more controversial by taking this country to the left, a philosophy that most Americans say they don't support. The polling shows most Americans still consider themselves more conservative on fiscal issues. So that confluence of factors, I think, produced this historic shift in the Congress. So I really believe this was a repudiation of the Obama first 2 years in office. And generically, even in Pennsylvania, in our most recent statewide poll for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, we asked Pennsylvanians, if the election for Congress were held in your area today, would you vote Republican or Democrat? And most people said Republican. And this is still a very Democratic state. So it's no surprise 5 Democrats went down to defeat this week in the Pennsylvania congressional delegation.
Well, we went from the U.S. Senate. Let's go to the congressional races here in Pennsylvania. We had a congressional delegation that changed complexion during this election. You want to give us your quick summary of how the Republicans did in this area?
In this area, in the mid-state in particular?
No, in terms of Pennsylvania's congressional delegation.
Sure.
It's
well,
changed.
there were 5 seats. Ultimately, there were actually 8 seats the Republican Party believed were in play. They won 5 of the 8. The 5 they won were the 3rd district based out of Erie, PA, where Kathy Dahlkemper was defeated. The 2nd district, the 2nd seat that the Democrats lost was the 11th district in the Luzerne County region, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton market, represented by Paul Kanjorski. The 3rd was in the northeastern part of the state as well, represented by Chris Carney. The 4th and 5th were in the southeastern regions of the state, districts held by Joe Sestak, formerly in Congress, now represented by Pat Meehan, who just was elected. And the 5th was Mike Fitzpatrick, who reclaimed a seat he had lost in 2006. So you had 5 seats swing. And
which makes the final lineup how many Republicans versus how many Democrats?
Oh boy, now you're putting me on the spot. We just went from 12D, 7R to, if you back out those 5, you're now flipped to a very similar ratio in favor of the Republicans, which is actually where we were just immediately following the 2002 election. So in 10 years, this delegation has flipped from D to R back to R to D. What those 5 have in common, I think the fundamental point your viewers would want to know, when you look at the 5 districts that flipped, one of them was an open seat. So the dynamics there were different. The Joe Sestak seat that was vacant between Brian Lentz and Pat Meehan was a little unique. The other 4, Dahlkemper, Kanjorski, Carney, and Patrick Murphy, What did they all have in common? All 4 were supporters of the president's policies. By and large, all 4 of them voted for health care reform, his economic stimulus bill, and were largely defeated because those elections became referendums on the president.
Interesting.
None of those 4 could survive because they all represent swing districts that have a tendency to vote from D to R and back and forth. All 4 of those districts, less than 10 years ago, were represented by Republicans. Think about that. So these were swing districts that ultimately are in play really in many elections. The 5th was the open seat, and I think the Republican wave was just too strong for Brian Lentz to really kind of overcome.
Well, there weren't any real big surprises in the governor's race, so not that I want to skip over that, but I do want to touch base on the House of Representatives in Pennsylvania. And it was a pretty significant shift to a Republican, but there were some big surprises, and one of the biggest ones was Todd Eaches. So, and then the other one was that Bill DeWeese was reelected. So, how do you explain? Can you compare and contrast? How does Todd Eaches lose his seat and Bill DeWeese retain his?
Fascinating seats. Let's start with the DeWeese seat. That district in Greene, Fayette, and Washington counties is a very strong Democratic district. 70% of the voters in that district are registered Democrats. That is a very tough seat for Republicans to win. Now, admittedly, Republicans carried it at the top of the ticket. Both Toomey and Tom Corbett carried Bill DeWeese's district. But down ballot, I think you saw voters more likely to still support Bill DeWeese. In the primary, Bill DeWeese ran a campaign based on the fact that he was the guy that had the clout and the seniority to bring Bunny back home. That was enough to get him over the finish line in the primary. It was enough to get him over the finish line in the general election. I think the Republican candidate in that seat, who was a former Republican county chairman, was just too much of a jump for dying-the-wool Democrats to vote for a former Republican county chairman for state representative in a district where 70% of the voters are Democrat. In the Northeast and the Eaches seat, you had a much similar situation. That's a very competitive seat. Used to be held by a Republican, Tom Stish, before Todd Eaches.
Absolutely.
That district was carried by Lou Barletta this week in the race for Congress. It's voted Republican in the past. So it was a much more competitive seat. Tara Toohill was in the position to really make this race competitive because she ran a smart campaign. The polling showed Governor Rendell was not popular in the district. Todd Eaches, of course, was a leader of the Democratic agenda for Ed Rendell. So she had some factors working for her that I think put her in the game. What really tipped it, in my opinion, though, was the national recognition Tara Toohill got. She was written up in the Wall Street Journal just 3 weeks ago for taking on the majority leader of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and was the recipient of some major national money that got her some very significant resources down the stretch to be able to communicate a message that she would be, represent the kind of change that the area was looking for. So that seat was clearly more competitive for a lot of reasons.
Interesting.
Yeah, in the last the 30 seconds is interesting, too. I mean, the Pennsylvania Senate was the only Republican legislative chamber in the whole Northeast. It was under Republican control, and I guess now the Republicans picked up both the House and the Senate in New Hampshire. But we want to thank you for being with us today, Jim, and we look forward to having you back and talk about some future elections. We have some interesting months coming up here, to be sure. Maura and I are anxious to follow it. We will be back with you next week for another edition of Behind the Headlines. We'll see you then.